My name is Donna Miller, and I'm the CEO and co-founder of Purse Power. Purse Power is working to help women use their massive purchasing power to drive positive change. We believe that if women who make 80% of all purchasing decisions would choose to buy from the companies that actively promote women, and we would do that in mass, and we could create a funding stream for battered women's shelters in the process, that we could shatter glass ceilings and change lives. So that's what we're trying to do at Purse Power. Just quickly, we meet every Friday at 10 Central. We've done about 60 of these. We've had major national speakers come on the program, and with people with great insight like Dr. Khan. She's got an international perspective, which we don't always have. If you would like to watch our prior episodes, just go to pursepower.com/coronavirus. And then please do take a look at those. And we post our speakers for every Friday, every Monday morning. So you can register any week you like just by going to our website. Anything else we need to say? Okay, I'd like to introduce you, Dr. Khan.
Thank you.
There we go. Here we go. I'm excited to have you here. Several of us are. Dr. Khan is a native of Cashmere, and she's the author of 2 critically acclaimed books, The Fiction of Nationality in an Era of Transnationalism, and Islam, Women, and Violence in Kashmir between India and Pakistan. And by the way, I had to go look up some of the terms you used in your bio to make sure I understood what they were. So I'm going to try to translate if I can. Her books are used as a teaching text in several universities because of the growing interest in Kashmir. And she'll talk to us about why that's true in just a minute. Most recently, Nyla has edited a major anthology, The Parchment of Kashmir, History, Society, and Polity, which develops an unparalleled understanding of the region's culture, resilience, and fate as a political pawn. Her 4th book is a hybrid form of academic memoir and biography on her maternal grandmother. And I want you to talk about your family because your family is really interesting. Dr. Khan is also a regular contributor to Red Dirt Report, Oklahoma, the Norman Transcript, and the Oklahoma Observer, and the Edmond Sun. And we didn't say that she's also a commissioner on the Oklahoma Commission on the Status of Women. Nyla also works with diverse cultural and social groups and helps them to think about national pride, blended cultures, religious fundamentalism, and the resistance to culture and linguistic differences. So you're going to have to talk about what that means, okay?
Absolutely.
All right. Absolutely. Okay. So to begin, we want to get to know you. Could you please give us a high-level understanding of your life and career?
All right. Well, first off, thank you very much, Donna. It is a pleasure to be interviewed by you. And I'm very excited to meet everyone here, all very accomplished women. So I am, as Donna mentioned, I'm originally from a place called Cashmere, which is technically in India. And Kashmir has been a conflict zone since 1989. So it is a highly militarized part of the world. Not just militarized, but it has been besieged by militant groups as well. So the civilian population has been caught between the devil and the deep blue sea, militancy and militarization, which makes it incredibly challenging to lead a normal life in that part of the world. I was raised in Kashmir and lived there until the age of 18. Interestingly, I went to Catholic school in what is a predominantly Muslim region. And my first educators after my parents were Irish Catholic nuns. So in the 70s and the 80s, we had these very dedicated Catholic missionaries in India who provided quality education to people there. And I was fortunate to be taught by them, to be educated by them. And the kind of upbringing that I had was, what is the term I'm looking for? Secular in a positive way, not the negative connotation of secular, but the positive connotation. So my family was Muslim. And at home, I was taught to read the Quran. I was taught to observe Islamic religious practices. And in school, I was taught about Christianity, Catholicism, religions of the world. Every afternoon, we would go to chapel. We loved going there. For the longest time, every time I was anxious, it was in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost. And I knew all the Christmas hymns like the back of my hand. It was an honor and a privilege to participate in the annual Christmas pageant. So it was an upbringing that encompassed several cultural, religious, and linguistic traditions. You see, my native language is Kashmiri, but in school, my first language was English, because that was the language of instruction. And it was the Queen's English, British English, right? And the official language of Kashmir was Urdu. So all our road signs, official documents, governmental documents were in Urdu. So basically, I grew up trilingual. And then in 1998, my husband and I came to the States and spent some time in Oklahoma because I had family here. And I was lucky enough to get into the Department of English at the University of Oklahoma. It was an absolute pleasure to work with some amazing academics at the university. Academics who enabled me to broaden my horizons, to explore various possibilities, and to grow intellectually. So I call Norman my second home after Cashmere. Norman is where I came into my own. Norman is where I became my own person, you know, independent, emotionally, intellectually, and that was a step in the right direction. And from there, I went on to publish. So the first book that you mentioned, The Fiction of Nationality in an Era of Transnationalism, that was my PhD dissertation. And it was published by Routledge Books in New York City. And that was just so exciting for me, so exciting to have a book published by an American publisher. And their distribution is amazing. So to see copies of my book at libraries, college and university libraries across North America did a lot for my confidence,
Exciting.
you know, my sense of accomplishment. And that was really exciting. And then, Donna, I lived in Nebraska for 5 years. I taught at the University of Nebraska at Kearney. Oh. Kearney at the time was a rural town, but a university town. And it had a population of about 30,000. So it was a pleasure to teach there, to teach world literature. I felt like I was doing pioneer work at the university. And it was easy to raise my child at that university town because everything was close by. You know, it was like a village, just very convenient. So that was a wonderful experience. Returned to Oklahoma in 2010. And since then, I've been teaching here and have been very involved with local organizations.
Okay. Now, wasn't there something about your family and your family in Kashmir? Are you going to talk about that? So I think
sure.
That they were, yeah.
Sure. So my father, who passed away in 2020, was a physician. And unlike a lot of physicians, he was a very well-read man. So very, very erudite, very knowledgeable. And he is the one who encouraged me to pursue higher education. I think it was because of his influence that I cultivated an interest, not just in English literature, but Urdu literature as well.
Okay, and so I think that there's something about your family in terms of them being given a hard time in Kashmir. Am I right about that?
Yeah. So my maternal grandfather was the first Muslim prime minister of Kashmir. When India became independent in 1947, Kashmir chose to accede to India. And subsequent to that accession, my grandfather was made prime minister of Kashmir. And he remained in office until 1953. That was when he fell out with the prime minister of India, was undemocratically ousted and arrested, and remained a political prisoner for the next 22 years.
Wow.
He was allowed to return to Kashmir in 1972 He then, in 1977, ran for office again in what is still considered the freest and the fairest election in South Asia. He won a landslide victory and remained in office until 1982, when he passed away.
Okay.
And there were about over 1 million people at his funeral.
My goodness.
So he was arguably the most popular leader of Kashmir.
Okay.
And he remains as glorified as he is vilified. You know, with public figures, there is a multiplicity of opinions.
Okay.
And
Okay.
there are people who place him on a pedestal. There are people who glorify him. There are people who, for all intents and purposes, worship him, but there are others who vilify him, right? There are others who demonize him. And we see that with every statesperson.
Sure. Makes sense.
And then after he passed away, my oldest maternal uncle was elected head of government. And after my uncle retired or stepped back, his son was elected head of government. So democracy in South Asia remains dynastic. You know, name recognition counts for a lot. And once the populace gains familiarity with a dynasty, they would much rather vote members of that dynasty into office than others who might be more qualified, but whom they don't know very well. You see, it's like the Bushes in this country, right? I mean, that's a form of dynastic politics, right? Or the Kennedys in this country. The Kennedys, for all intents and purposes, are American royalty. So name recognition in politics counts for a lot. But anyway, to go back to your question, in 2019, the autonomous status of Kashmir was revoked by the federal government of India. And after the revocation of the autonomous status of Kashmir, several political figures were placed under house arrest. And that included my uncles, my aunt, a couple of cousins. My parents were placed under house arrest for 3 weeks.
Okay. Wow. All right. I'm hoping you haven't frozen. Is this on my end or her end?
After that, they were allowed to.
Okay.
Are we okay? Yeah.
Yeah, we're all right. Okay, so, very good.
All right. So my uncles and my aunt who were placed under house arrest are octogenarians.
Oh my gosh.
Despite that, they were considered political threats and were not released for about 9 months.
Wow. Okay. All right.
A long period. Yeah.
It is. All right. So tell us about the significance of Kashmir in the world. It's been called kind of a nuclear potential flashpoint. It's very dangerous for women. Tell us more about that.
Yes. Yes. So Kashmir historically is disputed territory. It has been disputed territory since 1947. Which, as I said, is when India became independent and Kashmir acceded to India. The 3 nuclear powers that have been vying for Kashmir since 1947 are India, Pakistan, and China, making Kashmir a nuclear flashpoint. And since 1947, democratic elections have been sporadically held in Kashmir, but a lot of undemocratic methods have also been employed, including the dismissal of my grandfather's government in 1953 and his subsequent arrest. So democratic structures and institutions in Kashmir have been feeble or tottering for a while. And they became even weaker after 1989, which was when an armed insurgency erupted in Kashmir. the response of the government of India to that armed insurgency was belligerent, and it was aggressive as well, right? So on the one hand, we have these militant groups and organizations, some of which had extremist fundamentalist agendas. On the other hand, we have the Indian military and paramilitary forces that were just as belligerent, just as aggressive as these militant organizations. And in such situations of conflict, civilians, innocent civilians, inevitably get involved and they bear the brunt of the conflict, particularly women and children, which is exactly what happened in Kashmir. So for over 3 decades, the people of Kashmir have witnessed egregious human rights violations that militant organizations, as well as Indian paramilitary troops, have been responsible for. And I remember when the armed insurgency that I mentioned erupted in Kashmir, I was in the 12th grade. And that's when things were starting to get unstable. There was still a semblance of normalcy, but things were starting to get unstable. And parents would be worried about their children, particularly about their daughters, because girls, women in such situations are rendered even more vulnerable, right? It becomes difficult to protect them. And in a society that is traditional, conservative, and patriarchal, women and girls are considered repositories of culture and tradition. You see, women and girls in very traditional societies are considered, well, they kind of symbolize the purest values of the culture, right? And men consider girls and women their honor. So it becomes incumbent upon them to protect their daughters, to protect their mothers, sisters, wives, whatever.
Okay.
So yeah, so that was the situation then. And so, as I said, the autonomous status of Kashmir was revoked in 2019. Kashmir was cut off from the rest of the world for several months. There was no internet connectivity. For me, it was impossible to get information about my family for about 3 weeks in August of 2019. I had no clue how they were doing. And at the time, my father was unwell. He had been diagnosed with lung cancer, but I could get no news at all, you know, because there were no telephone connections, no internet connectivity. Newspapers were not, well, they were covering the revocation of the autonomous status, but they couldn't get the real news because the media didn't have access to the valley. So, yeah.
Wow, do you see parallels? I'm sure you do, between Kashmir and Ukraine.
I see parallels between Kashmir and several conflict zones. Yeah, not just Ukraine.
Right.
And yeah. So real quick, while researching for my book, Islam, Women and Violence in Kashmir, I did a lot of archival work as well as field work across Kashmir. And I talked with people from several walks of life. And I talked with women from diverse socioeconomic backgrounds and of diverse political and religious leanings. And the one common denominator that I saw was the vulnerability felt by women. You know, could be women in politics, could be women below the poverty line, could be working class women, professional women. They all felt vulnerable. They all felt unprotected, right? Because unfortunately, as we know, as history has taught us, in situations of war, in situations of conflict, women are the ones that inevitably suffer. And a lot of the time, it is those who are called to protect them who end up exploiting them even more. Right? If you delve into the situation in the Balkans, like Bosnia, Serbia, Herzegovina, Croatia, those places, and you read about the role played by UN peacekeeping troops, you will see that those troops exacerbated the situation for women.
How so?
Well, if you read about the Balkans, or you read about Chad, even, you read about Haiti, about the sexual exploitation of women and children in those places, about the mushrooming of brothels, right, in those situations. Militaries, a lot of the time, that are called to protect citizens, peacekeeping troops that are called to protect citizens, are complicit in the exploitation that occurs. And we saw that in Kashmir as well. Because you see, in conflict zones, Donna, militaries enjoy a carte blanche. There is a lack of accountability. There is a lack of transparency. No one can hold their feet to the fire. And institutions become very weak. And once institutions become weak, there is no accountability. Right?
Yeah. Wow. How hard. Okay, well, I'm going to skip some questions about the tourism and things like that, but I want to hear about the similarities maybe between China's treatment of the Uyghur Muslims, India's treatment of the Kashmiri Muslims, this rise in authoritarianism worldwide. Can you talk about that?
Sure. So for the past several years, we have been seeing this rise in authoritarianism, authoritarian governments in several parts of the world. Even those parts. Now, in my writings on Kashmir, I try to look at Kashmir as a political issue, not a religious issue. Right? So I write about the movement for self-determination several religious communities were involved in historically. It wasn't just the Muslim community. You see, in my childhood and adolescence, Kashmir was a lot more diverse than it is today. So I went to school with not just Muslim kids, but Hindu, Christian, Sikh, Buddhist kids as well. And the diversity that we saw back then, we don't see it any longer. Populations in several parts of the world have become more homogeneous because of the rise of totalitarianism or authoritarianism in those parts of the world, right? And as you correctly pointed out, we read about the treatment of Uyghur Muslims in China. And we read about how the treatment of those people, of that ethnic group, is genocidal, of how attempts are being made by the Chinese government to, within quotes, to re-educate the Uyghur community, which is a euphemism for putting them in concentration camps behind bars and dehumanizing them, right? Inflicting atrocities on them, inhumane treatment on them, to remold them in whatever way the Chinese government wants to. Now, in India, unfortunately, again, growing up in my childhood and adolescence, India was a country that embraced diversity. India was heterogeneous, it was colorful, it was exciting, because you would see multiple cultures, multiple ethnic groups, religious groups, linguistic groups coexisting. celebrating festivals, events of every religion together as one. So India back then was exciting. It was like when I went to Catholic school, Christmas was as big a deal as Eid, which is an important religious festival for Muslims, you know?
Mhm.
And Christmas was celebrated with as much reverence, with as much aplomb as we celebrated Eid. We would go to the chapel at my school with as much respect as we would go to the mosque. But so I miss that. I miss the openness that people had back then to embrace diversity. Now what I see in several parts of the world is a fear of the other, a closed-mindedness, an unwillingness or an inability to embrace, to celebrate and embrace diversity. I don't see that any longer. There is a paranoia in people. There is a suspicion in people of what they don't recognize, a suspicion of the unfamiliar. And a lot of the time that trauma can lead to violence. That paranoia, not trauma, that paranoia can lead to violence. It can incite violence, as we have seen with the increase in hate crimes the world over in several parts of the world, right? So we have been witnessing Islamophobia, not just in the United States, but in other parts of the world as well, which has led to the stereotyping of one religious community, unfortunately, which has led to the dehumanization of one religious community. And that just increases polarization, Donna, right? That polarization, so I talk a lot about this in my classes. I talk a lot about this in my public lectures, that increasing polarization does not work for anybody. That is not in anyone's best interest. So if you think about it emotionally, you think about it politically, you think about it economically, in economic terms. How do we build bridges with other ethnic, racial groups? How do we build bridges with other countries for political purposes, for economic purposes? It is only by overcoming those divides, right? By cultivating the ability to build bridges across political divides, ideological divides. That is necessary. You know, I think it is the need of the day to recognize that we all live in a global village. We cannot afford to be isolated in this day and age. And building, yeah, go ahead. No,
I was going to ask you, what role do you think women play in helping to close this divide?
I think women play an incredibly important role. So just to give you an example of another conflict zone, Northern Ireland, which has gone through a lot of ups and downs, through a lot of political turmoil and turbulence. When it came time to build bridges and talk peace, women played an incredibly important role. It was women who knocked on doors and talked about the importance of forging dialogue, of talking with one another across differences. It was women who brought the troops, the British troops, right, the members of the IRA and the civilian population to the negotiating table and said, we need to talk peace, because violence and conflict will not get us anywhere. Of course, Northern Ireland, you know, I don't want to sound Pollyannish or naive. Conflicts don't end overnight. And it isn't like Northern Ireland is now a utopia, right? Elements of conflict still exist there. But we've got to start the work of peace building, of negotiating, of bringing every stakeholder to the negotiating table somewhere. The work has to start. It might take a couple of decades, it might take an entire generation to get to where we would like to be. But that's okay. We've got to initiate the work.
I want to ask how. Okay, so how? I hear about the knocking on the doors, and I think your point is really, really well taken. What are the things you think women could do, we could do in the United States?
Right. So I think to give you a couple of concrete examples, I don't want to sound too abstract. It's like when I started out, I was pretty elitist. Okay, I'm being very honest and I'm being very candid.
Yeah.
I had a doctorate. I had read all these books. I knew the jargon so well, you know, and I was just very elitist. I could only converse with a certain group of people, right? That is how it was. Didn't take me very long to recognize that that wouldn't get me anywhere. That my work would remain limited to a small group of people, and my work would be intellectually stimulating for them, but my work wouldn't be applied to real life situations. And I wanted it to be applied to real life situations. So you see, as a woman, I have the ability to not just empathize with people, but I also have the ability to be compassionate, right? So I'm empathetic. I can place myself in other people's shoes, and then I can make sure that my work is more action-oriented. And that's compassion. Compassion. When you try to improve people's lives, the lives of women and children, that is your empathy in action, right? So as women, I think that is possible. We are stereotyped as nurturers, and we are stereotyped as peace builders, but let's not forget that some women can be warmongers as well. And we've seen that historically, right? When you think about women in politics, there is a lack of women in politics. Look at our Oklahoma legislature, lack of women in the legislature. And a lot of women feel the pressure to toe a traditional male line because they don't want to come across overly soft. They don't want to come across as overly maternal. They think that would make them look weak. So they feel that pressure, you know, to toe the line of warmongers, right? To be aggressive. But the more of us there are in politics, other fields, the less the pressure to conform, right? So if we have a critical mass of right-thinking women, thoughtful, rational women, could be in politics, in economics, the financial realm, academia, the medical field, wherever. The more of us there are, you know, as I said, clear-minded, the less pressure there will be.
Yeah.
So I think that is necessary.
Very good point. Okay, I want to let people ask some questions here. So Nan McKay is asking whether the Taliban is present in Kashmir.
So, you know, that's a great question. So with the withdrawal of US troops from Afghanistan, there is a fear that the Taliban, who now find themselves at a loose end, will in all likelihood move over into the Kashmir region to further their agenda. So my take on the Taliban is that they are mercenaries. I see them as mercenaries, right? And to make this even clearer, when I think about Kashmir as a Kashmiri who was raised there, I think about the reconstruction of society. I think about repairing the culture. I think about repairing institutions. I think about rebuilding communities.
Mhm.
That is what I would like to focus on. But a mercenary is not interested in repairing cultures. A mercenary is not interested in reconstructing societies or holding institutions accountable. A mercenary is in it for the money and the thrill of it. And that's how I see the Taliban, or whatever role they play in Kashmir. And of course, there has been infiltration, right? Because they now find themselves at a loose end in Afghanistan, and they have an agenda. So there has been infiltration in Kashmir, and politics in Kashmir were not as fanatical as they are today. Right? Politics in Kashmir, while I was growing up in the 70s and the 80s, were not half as right-wing as they are today. Religion, of course, played a role, but not as important a role as religion seems to be playing today. Also, what we are seeing today in South Asia, not just Kashmir, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, to some extent in the United States as well, is right-wing versions of religion. So the version of Islam that a lot of militant organizations or mercenary organizations spout is a right-wing version that I certainly am not familiar with. It is a version that I was never taught to subscribe to. The Islam that I was taught to subscribe to is emancipatory. It is an Islam that gives rights to men and women, equal rights to grow, to evolve, right? It gives women a strong voice, the right to run for political office, the right to inherit property, gives women the right to voice their opinions, to stand up and be counted. That is the version of Islam that I know. So liberatory, emancipatory, and that is not the version that these right-wing political organizations subscribe to.
Okay. We got some questions coming in here. So Nan is asking, do you dare go back and visit, or do you fear consequences of not getting back out if you do?
You know, Nan, I go back once a year. And for the past several years, I have been going to rural university campuses and colleges in Kashmir to meet with students and to talk about various issues, including women's rights, women's education. In fact, my latest book, Educational Strategies for Youth Empowerment in Conflict Zones, which came out in 2021, has a chapter on the talks that I've given in Kashmir at colleges and universities. So I am, my attempt, whenever I go to these places, whenever I give talks across the United States as well, is to respect people's sensibilities. I have my politics, I have my ideology, but I try to not impose my politics on my audience. And I try to be as open-minded as possible. I've become a much better listener over the years. I listen to what people say, not to what I want to hear. And I forge dialogue across divides. I think I've become pretty good at handling conflict, actually. I've become pretty good at conflict resolution, actually, because my attempt is to be inclusive, to bring every stakeholder to the table. And sometimes at these colleges and university campuses, students say unpalatable things. You see, not everyone agrees with the politics of my family. Not everyone agrees with political decisions that my grandfather made. And these young people are impulsive. A lot of them are angry because all they've known their entire lives is conflict. And they are resentful as well. So they say unpalatable things, but I've learned to handle them well. I've learned to not take what they say personally. Instead, I try to get them to work through their opinions and their ideological positions.
But this could be a whole other show about college kids and getting them to see other sides of things. Go ahead.
Yeah, getting them to recognize that there is more than one point of view, more than one worldview out there. Yeah. And also, I think and really this comes with age to a certain extent. You know, you recognize that no problem will be solved unless everyone is willing to compromise. You know, when I was young and I had a chip on my shoulder and I thought the world was my oyster, I thought only weak people made compromises, that it was either my way or the highway. But then life teaches you so much, just makes you wiser. Experience teaches you so much. And you learn that problems cannot be solved unless everyone is willing to compromise. Unless everyone is willing to build common ground.
Very good. All right. Susan Cheers is saying, using your definition of mercenaries, would you characterize some of the politicians of the US who don't advance any policies but advance division and racism, all to raise funds, as mercenaries as well?
You know, that's a great question, and I hope I'm not shooting myself in the foot by saying yes. I absolutely would. You know, when the agenda is not growth, when the agenda is not evolution, when the agenda is not the betterment of the nation and the country and reconstructing the society, I think the politician is a mercenary. And politics, unfortunately, is now a very lucrative business, right? So in Cashmere as well, not just for mainstream politicians, but for separatist politicians or militants as well. Politics is a career. It is a very lucrative career. And a lot of politicians, a lot of militants in Kashmir, when they now talk about the right of self-determination of the people of Kashmir, that is a hollow slogan that gets bandied about whenever it works for them. You know?
Yeah.
So ideological commitment in this day and age is very rare. It's very rare. Great question.
I want to ask you a question that I don't want to miss here, if you don't mind. So I was wanting to ask you about the women in Kashmir, and they're caught all kinds of ways between patriarchy and conflict. They've suffered all kinds of ways. Can you give us an idea of both the challenges, but also the resilience and the resourcefulness of the women of Kashmir when they face these difficulties? Yeah. That's a really good question. So yeah, as you correctly pointed out, women are caught between a lot of, well, again, the devil in the deep blue sea, right? So on the one hand, you have patriarchy, you have religious fundamentalisms, you have cultural fundamentalisms, but then you have so let me put it this way. There are several women in Kashmir who's emancipated through a sense of responsibility toward the community. Does that make sense? Explain.
So a lot of emancipated women, who recognize that their emancipation needs to be mediated through a sense of responsibility to the community. So as emancipated women, what can they do to help their community grow? As emancipated women, what can they do to work with their communities? So they make headway. So they progress academically, economically, politically. To give you a concrete example, Donna, my maternal grandmother was raised in a traditional religious patriarchal family. She went to the convents of Jesus and Mary in Pakistan way back in the early 1900s, right? Very well-spoken woman, well-educated woman. She was highly traditional, ran for office twice in Kashmir, represented Kashmir twice in the Indian Parliament, was not just a political activist, but a social activist as well. She founded a vocational center for semi-literate and illiterate women in Kashmir in the 1970s, when such vocational centers were not seen in that part of the world, right? And always encouraged women's education, women's empowerment, but an empowerment that recognized the sensibilities of the society, the sensibilities of the community. You see what I'm saying? I mean, there is one form of emancipation that is revolutionary and radical. It is so radical and so revolutionary that it might destroy institutions, right? There is another form of emancipation that is more traditional. So as an emancipated woman, you recognize that your community has certain sensibilities, cultural, religious, and you respect them. You might not agree with them, all of them, but you respect them. You work with those people, right? And you respect the institutions that make your community feel safe. You bring about reform in those institutions, but slowly and gradually. That reform is not radical, doesn't happen overnight. That reform happens slowly, right? For the betterment of society. So I see a lot of women like that in Kashmir. So I see a lot of women in education, in politics, in the business world, young women in Kashmir, right? Who are breaking the glass ceiling in terms of becoming more autonomous, in terms of being independent, in terms of expressing their opinions, in terms of standing up and being counted. I see that. A lot of young women are now venturing into the business world, which is quite a thing in that traditional society. You know, we have small women-owned businesses in Kashmir now, which is exciting. It's an exciting development. And these women have shown that despite the conflict, despite the uncertainty, they have taken the bull by the horns. They have been able to rise above the conflict. They have been able to rise above the trauma. And they have converted the trauma into a strength, actually. You know, and they work with, for instance, Kashmiri handicrafts, local products that are made, manufactured by local artisans, local artists. These young women are making sure that they are now visible on the international map, you know? So that's an exciting development. So yes, it is a very resilient community. Yeah.
And the women are supporting each other. Okay, we're just about out of time. So let's see here.
The women are supporting each other, but I think we still have a long way to go, Donna. And we have a long way to go in this country as well. Unfortunately, what a lot of us still see in our own kind is an internalized sexism. So a lot of us still put one another down. right? A lot of us still mock one another. And we think, oh, this woman, who does she think she is? Honestly, that she could become that independent, that autonomous? Because we have internalized patriarchy so much. So I think that self-reflection is necessary. We need to question not just male-oriented institutions, but we need to question ourselves as well. We need to introspect. How much do we truly allow one another to grow?
Oh boy, I agree with you. I mean, I think it's all about, we do need to support each other. We need to hold women up. We need to help each other rather than pull each other down. And I think that's happening more now than when I was young.
I think it is.
Yeah. Okay, we are just about out.
I think so too. Yeah.
Good. All right. Unfortunately, we are almost out of time. So Nan is asking, okay, it sounds like what Afghanistan was before the Taliban came back. I wonder if those small businesses are still viable today in Afghanistan and what that portends for Kashmir. And then the other question, I wanted you to summarize the key learnings you want us to gain from you. So if you have
all right. So in response to Nan's question, Nan, even while US troops were deployed in Afghanistan, the Taliban was in control of large swathes of that country. So rural Afghanistan was controlled by the Taliban, even during the US regime or tenure, whatever you want to call it. And cultural change takes a much longer time than constitutional change or legal change. So the constitution of a country might give the women of that country the right to vote, the right to run for public office, but it takes much longer to change the cultural mindset and to actually implement those rights and those laws, right? And we've seen that everywhere. I mean, the US has not had a woman president, even though women constitutionally have enjoyed several rights for ages. So in response to your question about the plight of women in Afghanistan, I don't see the rule of the Taliban in that country portending well for women.
Nope.
Right? I don't see women gaining. So what is the word the term that I'm looking for? I write a lot about this. So token women, we will see them in every institution, right? Women who are portrayed as the symbol of independence or autonomy, they toe the line that the establishment, in this case the Taliban, wants them to toe. So you will see women in the parliament of Afghanistan, but they are token women, towing a very masculinist line, making sure that the status quo is not questioned, making sure that, feathers are not ruffled. And I don't know what the hope for women-owned and women-led businesses in that part of the world is, how much independence women could enjoy. But I do think that it is necessary for women in the United States to work with local women's organizations in Afghanistan. Instead of thinking that we can call the shots and we can tell them how to live and run their lives, I think we need to build collaborations with women-run and led organizations in Afghanistan. We need to build those collaborations in order to increase the access of women there to quality education, to quality healthcare, right? That is necessary. So I think where we go wrong is when we think that we can condescend to talk down to those women and tell them how to live. Those women live in a very different and very complex political situation, in a very complex cultural situation. We've got to build those bridges. We've got to help them improve their lives in that context, in that situation.
Okay, perfect.
What was your last question, Donna?
Well, I think we're at time. So if you could summarize quickly the biggest things you want us to have learned from you and actions you want us to take.
Oh my gosh. I've always been horrible at summarizing, but to summarize real quick, I think we need to build common ground. I think we need to recognize that my way or the highway never works. That attitude, that approach does not enable anybody to improve societies, to repair cultures. Cultures the world over, because of the rise of authoritarianism, have been destroyed. The culture that I was raised in was heterogeneous, it was diverse, it was a culture that celebrated diversity, that embraced diversity. I don't see that any longer. The homogenization that I see in several parts of the world, even some parts of the United States, is painful. So to repair that mosaic in which every woman can thrive and grow and develop, we need to talk to one another across our political differences, across our racial differences, right? We need to recognize that compromise is necessary in order to make situations win-wins for everybody involved, right?
Excellent, excellent.
Yeah.
Very, very good point. Okay, thank you so much for being here today, Dr. Khan. Whoops. Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Khan. I appreciate it. This has been terrific. If people want to follow up with you, how can they?
Well, email, Facebook, Twitter. I'm very active on Facebook. That is a forum I particularly enjoy because I'm so long-winded, Donna. I can write long posts. Twitter as well, LinkedIn.
Okay.
All right.
Perfect.
Well, thank you so much. This was terrific. I enjoyed talking with you.
Thank you. I learned a
lot. And I enjoyed the questions. Very good questions. Really good.
Excellent. Thanks, everybody. Sure appreciate it. Please do join us next Friday at 10 Central. We've got our monthly networking session, and you can meet women from across the country. People are making partnerships and customers and all kinds of things out of these sessions. And one last point before we go, please do like and share our social media pages. Please share this with your friends. Let them know that every Friday at 10 Central, we have this going on. And most of all, remember, please, purse power, we have it. Let's use it.
Absolutely.
Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care. Bye, everybody.